Thus far in our consideration of living things, I focused on the properties of individual organisms, their molecules, their cells, their genetic code, and how they evolved. But organisms never occur in isolation. One of the great principles of biology is that all individuals are part of ecosystems, which are complex communities of organisms and their physical environment. In this lecture, I want to accomplish three things. First, I'll describe the 6 characteristics common to all ecosystems. We'll see that ecosystems are complex collections of living and non-living components. Then I'm going to tell you about the law of unintended consequences, which says that you can't change part of a complex system without affecting other parts of the systems, sometimes in ways that are very unpredictable. And finally, we'll see how scientists study natural ecosystems using experiments and using theoretical modeling. Ecosystems are amazingly varied. Think about some of the pictures of ecosystems or some of the places you visited. You have arid deserts with almost no rainfall at all. You have lush tropical forests with more than 100 inches of rainfall a year. You have sun-drenched ponds. You have hydrothermal vents in the deep ocean floor. Yet all these varied ecosystems share 6 characteristics. First of all ecosystems are dependent on both living and non-living parts. The physical and chemical environment defines the non-living portions of an ecosystem. The environment, it includes the weather and the climate. It includes the nature of the local rocks and the soils, the temperature and the salinity of local bodies of water, for example, and so forth and so on. All of the different species, then, that interact in an ecosystem form an ecological community. Ecological communities may include a great variety of plants and animals, but they always include a host of microbes, one-celled organisms. They have to include organisms that convert sunlight or some other form of energy into food. Now, the second characteristic of all ecosystems is that they all require energy. Every natural system requires energy. Energy flows through an ecosystem according to the laws of thermodynamics. The flow of energy through an ecosystem, through the organisms, is called the food web. Every organism has to obtain energy either directly from its environment or by eating other organisms. The concept of the trophic level defines a hierarchy of energy producers and consumers in every ecosystem. A trophic level includes all the organisms in an ecosystem that get their energy from the same source. So you have plants, for example, which get their energy from the sun by photosynthesis. They constitute the first trophic level. They are the energy producers in most ecosystems. However, we also have those deep ocean environments where microbes that use the chemical energy of rocks are the primary producers. And in those ecosystems, it's the microbes that are the primary or the first trophic level. The second trophic level includes herbivores. That includes all the animals that eat plants. Then come carnivores that eat herbivores. That would be in a third trophic level. You also have bacteria and scavengers in many ecosystems that eat dead organisms, and they form yet another trophic level. At each trophic level, most of that available energy goes unused. Plants use only a few % of the sun's radiant energy that comes down and hits them. Herbivores harvest perhaps only 10% of the energy available in plants, and carnivores similarly use maybe only 10% of the energy of the animals that they eat. This trend is a direct consequence of the second law of thermodynamics. Since animals are like machines, they can't operate at 100% efficiency. This leads to an interesting consequence. The ratio of biomass of plants to herbivores to carnivores is typically about 100 to 10 to 1. And this is why large carnivores are relatively rare, because they get much less energy than the herbivores, and the herbivores get less energy than the original plants. So if you can imagine a picture of the Serengeti Plain, you have a few lions, but you have vast herds of wildebeests, hundreds of wildebeests for every one lion. Similarly, dinosaurs have the same kind of population controls. You might not get that impression because of the fame of Tyrannosaurus rex, but indeed there are only about a dozen known specimens of Tyrannosaurus rex in the entire world, and yet there are hundreds upon hundreds of the herbivorous dinosaurs on which the Tyrannosaurus rex must have eaten. The third characteristic of all ecosystems is that matter is constantly recycled. The atoms are used over and over again. This is just like any geochemical cycle. The atoms and molecules aren't destroyed. They're just reused, recycled. Let me illustrate this idea by the history of a carbon atom. You can make up your own history. This is sort of a fun game to play with children if you want to. You can pass the carbon atom around from person to person and see where it goes. A carbon atom could start as a gas molecule, for example, a molecule of CO2. And that CO2 molecule could be taken up by a plant and used to construct a blade of grass. Then you might have a cow come along and it eats that blade of grass, and the carbon atom is used to make some of the milk that the cow produces. And you might drink that milk in your breakfast coffee. Then that carbon might now be part of your tissues. Indeed, that carbon atom could remain in your body for the rest of your life. But eventually, you're going to die, and that carbon atom is going to return to Earth, and it will continue its endless cycle to be used over and over again. It's amazing to think that the atoms that are now in your body were once part of dinosaurs. They were once part of trilobites. That's inevitable given the way atoms are cycled over and over again in the history of life. The fourth characteristic of every ecosystem is that every organism in an ecosystem occupies an ecological niche. An ecological niche represents a specific strategy for obtaining energy and atoms from the environment. There are many, many examples you can imagine. If you have an insect that lives off the sap of bark in a specific kind of tree, that's an ecological niche. A worm that scavenges in shallow soil has its own ecological niche. A plant that thrives under the shade of a larger bush. Every organism has to compete for resources in its ecological niche. In general, therefore, an ecosystem doesn't support two species in identical ecological niches. Ecologists were puzzled once when they found two very similar species of birds living in the exact same tree in a forest. This is an example of violating this idea of ecological niches being occupied by single species. But when the ecologists looked more closely, they found that one bird lived in the lower branches and ate one kind of insect, and the other species lived in the high branches and ate a different kind of insect. So in fact, these were separate ecological niches, even though they were in the same tree. The fifth characteristic of ecosystems: populations of different species achieve a balance in a stable ecosystem. This situation is a consequence of the fact that matter and energy are limited resources, that they have to be shared by all the individuals in any ecosystem. Now, while species populations may vary with changes in weather or food supplies from year to year, the relative size of populations usually remains quite similar from year to year. The sixth and last of these characteristics is that a change in environment or the introduction or loss of a species can disrupt an ecosystem. This disruption can be gradual, as in a climate change, and as we shall see later on in this lecture, can be quite sudden and quite dramatic. Let me talk about the law of unintended consequences. Rapid and unexpected changes in ecosystems have led to this idea. Environmentalists now realize that ecosystems can be disrupted in ways you'd never predict. The law states the following: any change in one part of a complex system may affect other parts of the system in ways that are often unpredictable. A surprising and telling example is provided by the story of the near extinction of the Peters mountain mallow. That's a small flowering plant found only in Giles County, Virginia. The number of individual plants, though they were carefully monitored and protected, has steadily declined for year after year until in 1991 there were only 4 individual plants that had survived. Conservationists took heroic measures to preserve the remnants of this once thriving population. They included protecting them from any sort of forest fire, keeping them away from any of those sort of ravages. But in desperation, it finally dawned on them that fire might be a part of the natural life cycle of these plants. So they started a few controlled fires in the area where Peters mountain mallow had once been known to exist. The next spring it was remarkable. Hundreds of new Peter mountain mallow plants sprouted. It turns out the fire was essential to the plant's germination process. By protecting the plants from fire, conservationists had almost caused it to go extinct. There's sort of a morality play there. There are other stories that are much less happy in terms of their ending. And one of these is the story of Lake Victoria, the disaster that has really transformed Lake Victoria in the last 30 years or so. Let me set the stage. Lake Victoria is the largest freshwater lake in Africa. Millions of people live by its shore. Millions of people rely on fishing from the lake as a source of protein. In the 1960s, a large aggressive predatory fish called the Nile perch was introduced to the lake. This was to make a challenge for sport fishermen. A lot of tourists came to the lake at that period, and so this was a large aggressive fish that could be counted on upon providing the fishermen with something to really sink their teeth into, because all the other species of fish in the lake were much smaller and much less aggressive. The perch has no natural enemies in Lake Victoria, and it had vast supplies of these smaller fish, some of which were called tilapia, the fish that was the main staple of the diet of the African people who lived on the shores of the lake. The populations of these smaller fish plummeted as the Nile perch came in, and the number of Nile perch, of course, increased accordingly. Now, the smaller fish had done all sorts of ecological benefits to the lake. They had controlled surface algae, which they fed on. But soon, with the small fish gone, the algae spread over parts of the lake surface. Then the dead algae sunk, and this decaying algae, as it sunk into deeper part of the lakes, consumed oxygen where other kinds of fish lived, and so deeper water fish could no longer live in the lake. The tilapia had also controlled populations of snails, and these snails carried parasites which are harmful to humans. The incidence of parasitic disease has increased dramatically since the Nile perch was introduced. Well, the native fishermen now catch Nile perch, but this leads to another unintended consequence. The large fish have to be dried over a fire rather than sun-dried. With the small fish, you just lay the fish out in the sun, it dries them, and then you can use them as a long-term protein supply. The large fish, you have to build large wood fires to dry them out and preserve them. As a result, the forests have been stripped away from the lake's shoreline, causing extensive soil erosion into the lake and a further disruption of the ecosystem of Lake Victoria. Thus, we see the introduction of a single species of fish into a vast lake ecosystem has drastically altered that ecosystem, perhaps for all time, certainly for centuries, if not thousands of years. In many cases, causes of population changes in ecosystems are not nearly so obvious. In the 1980s, naturalists began to notice that evenings near swamps and lakes around the world, from Borneo to Boston, had become much quieter. It turns out that frog populations around the world have been declining at an alarming rate. There are some ecologists that view this change with a sense of foreboding. Disappearing frogs are to these environmentalists what dead canaries were to coal miners. You may recall that coal miners once took canaries down into the mines. These canaries would pass out if there was any potentially lethal gas. Anyway, some environmentalists think that the disappearance of frogs is a warning that something desperately wrong is happening to our biosphere, that immediate action is called for. Of course, there are other people with money and jobs at stake in any environmental change. They see a much more benign explanation. They say they're natural population cycles, or maybe weather is causing the frogs to remain hibernated for longer periods, that sort of thing. So it's a debate. No one's really sure the answer. The trouble is that biologists don't really know why frogs are disappearing. In the absence of some comprehensive theory of environmental change, any sort of scientific conclusion reflects individual ideologies as much as it does objective truth. You have environmentalists on the one hand, you have industrialists on the other hand, and both sides have their own axe to grind. Some observers tend to think of the environment as a fragile thing that's under assault by opportunistic industry, uncaring government, exploding world population, and so forth. Others believe that the environment is resilient and that human needs are a first priority, and that almost anything we can do to the earth will bounce right back and it won't matter. The fact of the matter is that humans, by their actions, do change ecosystems. We've seen that with Lake Victoria. What concerns many scientists is that we can't predict how the ecosystems are going to change. The law of unintended consequences constantly is coming into play. We know ecosystems can be affected in dramatic ways. We just can't predict how, we can't predict when. One thing is certain. As human population grows, we're going to alter the balance of matter and energy, and we do this in several different ways. First, we're constantly commanding an ever larger share of water and nutrients, and these are resources that all living things need. Natural processes gradually renew supplies of groundwater, and of course the nutrients in the soil are also renewed on a gradual basis. But human activities often consume these resources much, much faster than they can be replaced. In addition, humans are eliminating habitats through deforestation, through farming, through urbanization, and other sorts of endeavors that are common to the growing human population. By limiting the amount of food and energy available for other organisms, these activities can cause large-scale changes in local ecosystems, and they may affect the diversity of animal and plant species as well. These changes are gradual, but gradual changes over time can build up. During the past half-century, for example, the United States has lost more than half of its wetlands, wetlands that are vital to the migration of birds, for example. We have more than 90% of Brazil's vast tropical rainforest now destroyed, and more is being destroyed every day. And you don't have to look to other countries for this. You can even look very close to home. On my own college campus at George Mason University, I saw a dramatic example of this underway when we recently put in a new student union. This involved cutting down several acres of woodland because the George Mason campus is right in the middle of a wooded area. In that woodland, many squirrels were living. And when the trees were chopped down, the squirrels lost their home. And I saw the most amazing thing on campus. You would see squirrels fighting and killing each other on campus. Squirrels that normally just run around and play in the trees and collect their nuts and so forth, they had lost their homes. Some of those squirrels had to die because there was no longer room for them in that ecosystem. And so they changed their behavior entirely. It was really quite astonishing to see and somewhat disturbing, I might add. Humans also infect the environment by eliminating species. As I mentioned, many large animals have been hunted to extinction. It appears that we may be in the middle of a mass extinction event, especially of larger mammals and other large animals, as a result of human activity. We have high-tech overfishing of the oceans with huge trawler nets and so forth. These are things to be worried about and be concerned about if, in fact, we do eliminate certain species. Again, we can change ecosystems in dramatic ways that aren't predictable. It seems improbable to some commentators that common species of fish can be eliminated, but a similar fate befell the passenger pigeon. I want to remind you of that story. These North American birds numbered in the billions. It's described that when they migrated, you would see bands of birds blackening the sky as far as you could see to the right and left, front to back. And what hunters did is they take their shotguns and point them straight up at these bands of birds and just fire shot after shot, and the birds would fall from the sky by the hundreds. Eventually, these billions of birds were wiped out by overzealous hunters. The last of the passenger pigeon died sometime in the 19th century. Another aspect of human activity. Human activities result in a wide variety of air, water, and soil pollution, which may degrade ecosystems on a regional or on a global scale. 20 years ago, for example, the Chesapeake Bay, which is the largest estuary in the United States, boasted abundant water plants, birds. It teemed with commercially valuable crabs and oysters and fish. Today, those populations have been devastated largely by chemical runoff from farms and factories upstream, as well as overfishing. Naturalist Jane Goodall makes a sobering point about these human influences on world ecosystems, and I want to read you her quote. She says, "We love to point fingers when we try to deal with difficult problems such as the environment, to lay the blame on industry or science or politicians. And there is no question that industrialization has polluted our surroundings. But who buys the products? We do, you and I." One hope for understanding the behavior of ecosystems is experimental fieldwork. The usual protocol is to isolate a small system such as a lake or a stream or a small patch of land. Researchers then remove one species or they alter one variable for a long enough time period to compare any changes to those on a similar unperturbed system which is nearby, and that serves as a control. Let me tell you about the first of these studies. It took place in 1961 off the rocky Scottish coast. Biologist Joseph Connell manipulated and distributed the various species of barnacle, one called Balanus, and observed complementary changes in another species of barnacle called Shalamus. As a simple experiment as this was in concept, the idea of establishing a clear cause and effect relationship between one population and another was revolutionary in ecology, and it sort of set off a whole new kind of ecological study, an experimental field ecology. In 1966, American biologist Robert Payne followed Connell's lead and induced dramatic changes in an ecosystem off the Washington coast by removing one species of starfish. It was the dominant carnivore from that area. Within a year, the common California mussel had overwhelmed that ecosystem, crowding out most other invertebrates and greatly reducing the local diversity of local species. So by removing one species, many other species also disappeared from that ecosystem. These pioneering efforts guide many of today's ecologists who modify ecosystems one variable at a time to see how they're affected. Researchers, for example, have changed the acidity of entire lakes. They've added iron or other nutrients to patches of soil. They've introduced or removed species in enclosed areas. Some plant and animal species can be added or removed, and nothing much happens, while changes in other species can cause drastic effects, altering the entire ecological balance. This simple strategy of altering one variable or of a complex system at a time pervades modern biological research, from genetics to brain science. It's a kind of reductionism, if you will. It's a neat and clean surgical approach, and it reminds me of my very youthful attempts to understand my family's first black and white television set. My father was an electrical engineer, and he loved to play with electronics, and he built a television from scratch in the late 1940s. Well, each time something went wrong with that little television with its tiny round glass tube, he'd rummage around in the back, he'd replace one glass vacuum tube after another until the TV worked perfectly again. So as a small child, I began to think that each tube was in some way connected with one property of that TV set. That you remove one tube and the vertical alignment would go out, and you'd remove another tube and the horizontal alignment would go out, or the contrast would go out, and that sort of thing. And it seemed possible to understand all the workings of the TV just by removing individual components and seeing what happened. Well, unfortunately, neither television sets nor ecosystems are quite that simple, because all the components are complexly interconnected. Controlled experiments do indeed hold the prospect of revealing general principles about ecosystem behavior, and they certainly point out the severe unintended consequences that can result from the addition or the removal of a single species. But these experiments can't reveal the intricate interplay of all the different factors that work simultaneously. Complex ecosystems, like televisions, may behave chaotically when something goes wrong. There's an alternative approach to doing this kind of research, and that's to model ecosystems by computer. At the largest scale, we have global climate models. These are based on what are called global circulation models, or GCMs. And there's a kind of computer approach to understanding global climate. This approach divides the Earth's surface into uniform blocks, typically a few hundred miles on a side. And then each of those blocks, the vertical blocks, are further subdivided into horizontal slabs, maybe a dozen or so horizontal slices containing land and ocean, atmosphere, and so forth. These elaborate schemes include detailed information in every box on ocean currents or on wind speed, the humidity, the distribution of mountains, the cloud cover, vegetation. You have to know about atmospheric composition. You have to know the temperature, all different kinds of variables that you might associate with a chunk of atmosphere or a chunk of land that interacts with the atmosphere. The sun's energy then has to feed into the system and out of it again. There are ongoing exchanges of matter and energy between boxes, and those have to be governed by the laws of thermodynamics, the laws of motion, the conservation of atoms, and so forth. So you have lots of mathematical parameters that represent these boxes, which represent chunks of the Earth's atmosphere. In a typical experiment, the modeler sets up initial conditions and lets the model run through lots and lots of cycles, watching how the global climate changes. And what you have is a great advantage to these models because you can run controlled experiments on the entire Earth. You can rearrange the position of continents. You can change ocean currents. You can put mountain ranges in the way or get rid of the mountain ranges and see what happens. Each change in initial condition yields a different global outcome. We have models of ever sophisticated, increased sophistication now. We're able to duplicate many of the details that we read in historic climate change at this point. We can make plausible predictions about how key changes in atmospheric composition or in land position or in ocean currents might change global climate. Yet in spite of the success of some of these GCM approaches, no model is yet sufficiently complex to predict the Earth in detail. The boxes are just too large, for example. You need to have boxes only a few miles on the side rather than 100 miles on the side. Instead of 12 vertical sections, you might have to have 100 vertical sections. And even so, you need to be able to get finer and finer details and resolution to understand how the Earth really works. No matter how sophisticated these models become, there are always going to be uncertainties because our models are only as good as our current understanding of the factors that are important in global climate. I want to end by asking a more philosophical question. Why should we care about the disappearance of other species? After all, humans don't appear to be in any immediate danger of extinction. I think there are three compelling reasons that have been proposed for why we should preserve Earth's biodiversity. The first reason is that all species are interdependent on others. They're all part of complex ecosystems. Loss of one species may adversely affect the whole system with consequences that we just can't predict. They may be completely unexpected, and they may be very tragic. Damaged ecosystems, in turn, may affect rainfall and climate. They can affect soil nutrient development, erosion processes. You can change pollination rate. You can change pest control, water quality. All of these factors may be dependent on the preservation of ecosystems as they now stand. As more species are threatened, the risks to human of these adverse conditions increase. The second argument to preserve species focuses on our health and our well-being. Humans have enjoyed untold benefits from all the new foods, the new drugs, the new chemicals that are discovered as part of living things. Every living thing has its own unique set of genes, and therefore its own unique set of proteins. Each of those proteins has the possibility of serving a useful function as a chemical that we could apply to our own needs. There are countless natural substances, many of them of great economic value, surely that are remaining to be discovered. Each lost species, therefore, represents a lost opportunity for improving our lot. And finally, many people argue for species protection on ethical and on aesthetic grounds. Let me read you a quote by the eminent biologists Paul Ehrlich and E.O. Wilson. They state, "People have an absolute moral responsibility to protect what are only known living companions in the universe. Human responsibility in this respect is deep, beyond measure. We cannot easily measure our loss or our guilt in causing a species to become extinct." Let me summarize this lecture on ecosystems. All ecosystems share 6 characteristics. All ecosystems are dependent on both living and non-living parts. All ecosystems require energy. All ecosystems require matter, and they recycle that matter over and over again. Every organism in the ecosystem occupies an ecological niche. Populations in an ecosystem achieve a stable balance. And finally, changes can disrupt an ecosystem, often in unpredictable ways. According to the law of unintended consequences, a change in one part of a complex system may affect other parts of the system in ways that are unpredictable. And we saw that ecosystems are studied both by controlled experiments and by theoretical modeling. In the next lecture, we're going to examine today's environmental concerns in more detail.